Hey there, this is Jonathan, and in the following tutorial, we're going to create a bouncing ball scene using AnimateCC. Now, to begin this project, the first thing that we're going to want to do is create an HTML5 canvas project, 960 by 540, and I'm making it 30 frames a second instead of the default 24. Once you've created this document, go ahead and save it before you do any work. I always find that's good to do. And when you do save it, go ahead and save it in a folder by itself, because you don't want it to be in a folder with other files, because when you publish it, it can create a bunch of different files. Now, to look at what type of project we're going to create, here's a very, very simple version of this project. This is a screenshot from some sort of animation tutorial that was done in Flash, which is basically the same software. But we have a very simple stage where this ball is going to come in and then bounce along and go to the other side. Now you can see it's up on a ledge, and then it also has a floor that it's going to hit. And we're going to do a very simple setup in ours as well. Now, when it comes to our ball, we have to think about the way that it's going to move. Here you can see two bouncing balls, but you can notice the one on the left doesn't have any squash and stretch, and the one on the right does. Now that makes it a little bit more interesting, but also notice that there's no environment that these balls are in, so it doesn't really look like a great animation. We don't have any concept of how the ball is interacting in that scene. So we can add something as simple as a drop shadow, and it at least gives us the idea that there's a floor there, and it makes it a little bit more interesting. Plus, any little extras that we add in here could make it a more interesting animation as well. Now, this was the animation I was going to show, which is a bouncing ball in a basketball court. And of course, now we have a much better concept of what is going to happen in this animation just because of that. And just so we'd look at this one, we think he's going to shoot until he stretches out his hands and creates a different animation than what we thought was going to happen. So that staging of him looking like he's going to shoot gives us some sort of anticipation, and then you change that anticipation, and that makes an interesting animation. Now, we also want to think about the type of ball and how it's going to move, whether it's going to be a tennis ball or a beach ball or a football, might change the way that ball animates. We also want to be aware of the environment and what other elements of that environment we have access to. And the other thing just to leave us with is we want to think about, once again, the movement that we're doing across. Because a lot of these other animations, you see it's just going back up and down. And so this movement is going to make things just a little bit more complicated. So let's go back to our scene, and we're going to just set up our very beginning scene first. Now, in order to draw, I'm going to use the rectangle tool, and I'm going to put myself in object drawing mode, and I'm going to go ahead and just choose some basic background colors here. Not much at all. And I'm going to first draw a little floor, and I'm going to make sure that I'm off of the clipping thing. So I'm going to just draw a little floor here. And then I could also draw an object, if I want, that is actually the side. Now, here's one thing. We could do it kind of the way they have it in the sample, where that's all you get, but that's not visually that interesting. So maybe I'm going to change this concept up just a little bit, and I'm going to actually have this thing move along the floor, and this object, if I change it into a different color, can actually be a little bit of a ledge that it's sitting on, and I'm going to make that ledge maybe a different color. Let me go back to that normal color, and I'll make it a little darker. So now at least I have some sort of ledge that the ball will come onto. And instead of it hitting the floor up here where the border is, I'm actually going to make the floor the bottom of that object, because that's a little bit more interesting for us to be able to imagine, is that the floor is actually where the bottom of that object is. And so I'm going to draw just a quick line that goes across. And it doesn't really matter what that line color is for right now, because I'm going to delete that line later on. And then the next thing that I want is I'm going to have an oval on the other side. So I'm going to make that oval, and then I'm going to make it black. And I'm going to take off the stroke. I'm going to make that aligned with that line. You'll see I can snap it right down to there. And that's going to be a hole in the floor that that ball is going to fall into. So pretty simple to do. Set up this very simple background. And so I'm ready to call this my background. So I'll change my text there to background. Go ahead and lock the layer so you can't edit any of the content on that layer anymore. And then one of the nice little features is turning on the clip contents so that now all we see is just the very basics of what that scene looks like. Now I know that I'm going to do an animation. I have 120 frames out here, which is 4 seconds, and I can see that very easily all within this view without changing anything. So I know I want to extend out my animation to be about 120 seconds long. And so I can do that very easily just by going to the end and pressing the F5 key to extend that first keyframe the entire length of 120 frames. Now we're going to start to create the ball. So I'm going to create a new layer, call it the ball layer, and we need to create a ball. Now, when I create this ball, I'm going to make a different color. I think they had a blue one, which was what they had in their sample. It doesn't really matter what color we use, but I'm going to create a blue ball. And then with that ball, I'm going to make sure it doesn't have any stroke, just give it a fill. And I'm going to turn this thing into a symbol. And so when I've created this symbol, let's immediately give that ball an instance name, ball_MC. And you'll see where that's going to be important in just a bit. Now, just to make this ball a little bit more interesting, I'm going to visually go inside of it and just change things a little bit. Now, I've got a drawing object, but I can break this apart with Control B, and then I can do some other things on top of it. For example, I noticed they had this like stripe across it, which was kind of cool. And so I'm going to actually add a stripe as well for mine. Let's see what I want to do here. Actually, I want to have this be strokes and not fills. So I need to do the right thing. Give it a stroke and take off the fill. There we go. And I want to take this stroke and put it over the top of that ball. And now what I'm going to do is break this apart so I can then change the color on the inside. And so I'm going to give it kind of an orange stripe like they had, and then I'm going to get rid of that line. This at least gives me some sort of shape for that ball that I can see it as it moves and squashes and stretches. That's a little bit more than just that, what is it, the way that we had it before, which is just this blob of color. And though once you're done with modifying the ball, you can go ahead and go back to the main scene by double-clicking outside of it, and let's move this ball up to the ledge. And what's going to happen is this ball is going to come in and it's going to stop right there at the edge, and then when we click on it, we're going to start the animation. Now, one of the things that I like to do is kind of animate backwards. So one of the things that we want to be aware of is I tend to want to go to the frame where I want something to stop, and I want to make a keyframe, and then I want you to go backwards and then move the object off the stage so that you then have the ability to create a tween between the two, and then you basically animate backwards. So it's just something to be aware of. Now, the next thing that I want to be aware of is what's going to happen in this animation. So I'm going to kind of just go to the main points in this animation. So if I go, I'm going to just kind of randomly go through my different keyframes, but I'll say at frame 30, I'm going to make another keyframe with F6, and I know this is when the ball has gone down and touched the line. So we should be able to get it close down to there. Then I'm going to go to frame 45 or close to that, hit F6, and this is where the ball is back up there. Frame 55 maybe, or close to, and it goes back down to the line. Then we go back up, F6. Then I go back again, F6, and move it down. So here's basically what I have. Just a really simple animation at this point. I'm not even being perfect about what its position is yet. If you go ahead and give it some tweens in between these by selecting all the frames and using a classic tween, now you'll kind of be able to see where things move. But wouldn't it be nice if we could actually kind of see a little bit more about this animation? So one of the things that you can do is turn on onion skinning. And if you drag across a range of onion skinning, you'll be able to see a little bit about more where the positions are of this different object. And so you can now kind of see where it kind of comes down and then it goes a little bit an angle. And this angle is not halfway between those two. And so we can also do what's called edit multiple frames. And now with edit multiple frames, if you click off of it and you go to the one frame, you can then edit that one object and you can get a little bit better view of where that object is going to be at all of these most important parts. And I'm going to go forward and continue this animation just a little bit more. And that's going to go down. And then what's going to happen here is that it's going to fall down and go through that hole. Oops. I don't think I duplicated that particular frame. So it's there. I am seeing edit multiple frames, which is a little bit weird, but let's just see what we got. So it's there, and then it comes up to here. I'm going to take that back just a little bit. Whoops. And then this one looks like it's a little bit far below, so I'm going to take that up to where it should be, which is there at the edge. And then at the end, it's going to go down below. So it's at least just showing me an idea of how this animation would happen. And now we can kind of see where there might be some problems. This, to me, it looks like it's a little off. That needs to be a little bit lower. Like that can go down just a little bit. And you can see how if I extend out my thumb here, you can see how it comes in, then it stops here, it drops down and it bounces. And we want it to kind of be taller, and then it gets smaller, and you can kind of see the way that this animation works. I know it's a little bit weird. As soon as we turn off this edit multiple frames and turn off the other, which is onion skinning, now you'll be able to scrub your timeline and kind of see how that animation will work. Now what's going to happen is right here, it's going to go through, and we're not going to worry about the exact animation yet, because we've got some masking and stuff to do when we get to that. Now, one of the problems with this is that you'll see this animation is moving in complete straight lines. And here's the next thing that we want to add, which is a classic motion guide. Now, a classic motion guide now allows me to create a path that this object can move along for all of these points. To be able to see all those points, once again, we might need to turn on the onion skinning and even turn on the edit multiple frames. And here we can see even a little bit better if we just have the edit multiple frames, because we can see where our object is at all of those main keyframes, which is kind of nice. Now, with the guide layer turned on, we're going to create a path. And the path you want to extend from the one object to the next and make a curve at the top and a point at the bottom, curve at the top, point at the bottom, curve at the top, point at the bottom, and then I'm going to make a curve as it goes into that hole. And I might need to make that just a little bit further down because it looks like I didn't get to that. Yep. And what we're trying to do is get these points basically to the center point of that object as it is right there. These might be a little bit harder there, but when we have the sharp point, you'll see that they can snap right to that corner point or right where that object is currently. Now, what this curve does is allow us to actually animate according to that curve. Since we're on edit multiple frames, we can't see the animation, so I'll turn that off. And now you'll see we can have the ball travel along that path, which is really, really cool. Now, something that's very important about that path is you have to make sure that it's touching the center point of that object. Otherwise, we are not going to get that to work. You might also notice that the animation doesn't happen until right here. So we could just move that path to later, to frame 15, and then have the path start. And you can always create new paths at any individual keyframes and have it travel on that new path. We just have one continuous path for animation, which is kind of cool. Now there's another thing that we can do with this. You'll notice that right now this path kind of curves a little bit, and we can actually change our animation so that we can orient to the path. So by orienting to the path, you can actually see the ball can actually move according to that path as well. Now we have to do that for all the different sections, just so you know, orient to path. And now at least you'll get to see some sort of movement in that ball. Now controlling that movement so it looks just right, that's a little harder to do. You can see right there, it goes a little wonky on us. So one of the things that we have to be aware of is how to actually rotate this stuff the right way. Sometimes what we have to do is create one keyframe on one side of the path and another keyframe at the other side of the path, and then rotate the ball according to that path. I'm not going to do that right now, but at least you can kind of see that we get some sort of movement in that ball. Now, the next thing that we need to do is just go ahead and set up the basic interactivity for this animation. So we're going to create a new layer, and this new layer is going to go up the top, and this new layer is going to be called Actions. This is going to control everything that happens, or it's going to be how we stop and start the animation. Now, the first thing that we want to put here at the very beginning is a keyframe or a name for mine, which is Start. I like using Start, and you'll see down here at the bottom, it's created a little label on that keyframe that lets us know. Now at frame 15, we're going to create a new keyframe. So we'll do an insert a keyframe. We can also press F6 to do that. And this is going to be the anim right there. Now what's going to happen is right before that, I actually want this thing to stop. Now what I really needed to do was consider, did I want to stop at the frame before or right there? And I'm actually going to stop at frame 15. So I'm going to actually create a new keyframe. Oops, a new keyframe at that point with F6. And I'm actually going to have a keyframe right at frame 15 before I have the animation keyframe. At this keyframe, I need to put in some code. And so we need to bring up our code window with the F9 button. And it's going to have this dot stop. Now what this dot stop is going to do is allow us to stop the timeline. Then we need to have some code on here that tells the timeline to play when we click on the blue ball. You'll notice once again that we gave our blue ball an instance name from the beginning, and so that's going to be important. Now, if you've clicked on the ball, be aware that it's taking you off of your code window, so we need to go back and click back on Actions frame 15 or whatever frame that you've got. And it should be where you've got your this.stop action already happening. And now we have to add the code for our button. Now to add the code for our button, this is a little bit more tricky in our coding, but it's this dot, the name of the button, which I just copied, ball_MC. So this refers to the main timeline. And then this is the object that's on the main timeline. And we want to add an event listener to that button. Now that event listener has to have code inside of it. And so I'm going to put those codes in these brackets. And the first thing that it has is the type of event that we're listening for. And the next thing that it needs is the name of the function that we want to run. And so I'm going to call it play anim is the name of my function. And then we have this other little thing that we have to do called bind this. And what it does is it says, let's make sure that we make this function available on the main timeline where I'm currently at. The next thing that we need is to create the function called playAnim. Now I like to copy and paste these. And so we're going to create a function, and that function has the parentheses in here as well, but then it has curly brackets, an opening and ending curly bracket. The reason that the parentheses is here, and you could have a space or not, is that here's where we'd put arguments if we had any, but since we don't have any, we can just go ahead and do function play anim, and then we need to have the brackets and then also the curly brackets, the parentheses and then curly brackets. And now we want to say this dot play. Pretty simple right now. Now, what's going to happen if we test out our movie now? Let's make sure that we save it and we test our movie in the place. You should be able to see that we click on it and it plays the animation, and then it should replay the animation and allow us to do it again. That's pretty cool. Now, with this animation, we also want to consider our code at the end, because we know when we get to the end of our timeline, we also want to have a keyframe there with F6, and at this new keyframe, we're also going to put a this dot stop. What that's going to do is stop the main timeline again. Make sure that we don't have that moving forward. Now, if we did that and we tested this again, we should now get a stop at the end. And if we can still see the ball, we should be able to click on it and restart the animation. Now, the problem is that what we really want is something different to happen, because we really want to imagine that that will be gone. That button will be gone. So instead, what we need is maybe some text. Replay. So I'll put a little replay message. Maybe change the size of that, make it a little bit bigger. And now what I'm going to do is convert this into a symbol, and I'm going to call this a button symbol. Replay button. Now, there is one reason that I used this text, and it's really, really important for the reason I did that. And I didn't even really think about the way that where I was putting this button. But I just want you to be aware that if you turn text into a button like this, you will have some problems, and you'll notice when I try and hover over this thing that it only works when my mouse is over the exact text. And that's a really, really bad idea when it comes to text. And here's how we fix this. Let's double click to go inside of the button, and you'll see that we have an up, over, and down and a hit state within this button. I'm going to duplicate the up and over states and change the color of the text just a little bit so I know that I get some sort of hover effect. But then for the hit state, I'm going to insert a keyframe, and I'm going to create a box that goes over the top of that text. Now, I still have the text there, and it probably would be good for me to get rid of that text, just so I don't have both there at the same time. But it doesn't really matter. As long as you have a solid box on the hit state, now when we test that movie, and we play the animation, then you'll see that we have a solid something or other we can click on for that replay button. Now, this replay button does need to be on its own layer, so I'm going to cut that and create a new layer for the replay button. Then I'm going to create a keyframe to put that button on, and I want this button to come in just a little bit after the ball has disappeared. So I'm going to create a new keyframe here, so that can be just F6 as well. Then I'm going to paste that button with Control V and then move it to where I think it should be. And I'm going to move it over here on the right hand side. Then I can go ahead and maybe animate this button in. So I'm going to have it, let's make sure we're putting it on the right action. I didn't move it to the right layer, looks like. I put it on the wrong layer. So I'm going to put it on the play button layer, and then at the very end, I'm going to have a new keyframe, and then I'm going to go back to the first one and change it alpha to 0. So it fades in, and I create a classic tween. So now you'll see that button comes in before I get to click on it. Now we need an instance name for that button, and I should have done that at the very beginning. So let's go back to the first keyframe, call it replay_btn, because it's really a button and we want our code to know that. And then I'll go to the second one, make sure I have the same instance name. And then instead of our code, let's go back to our code window here. Instead of our code using the button to click on it, we're going to create a copy of our original function and event listener pair, and we're going to paste it to the end keyframe. And here's where we're going to change it to the replay underscore button object. And we're going to say replay animation. And so we need to rename our function to replay. And then instead of this play, we're actually going to tell it to go right back to the very beginning. So we're going to say go to and play. And then we're going to tell it to go to the actual start section. This is always a good idea to use a label instead of using frame numbers in your go to and play events and go to and stop, because that way if you move things around, you can always jump back to that point, even if that point is a different part of the timeline. So let's test this now and see if it's working. Now we click on the ball, it plays the animation, and now we have the ability to click on the message. Now, certainly we should consider a message here as well that tells us click on the ball to start, because that would make it certainly more interesting. We could also add some timing, some squash and stretch, and some timing, easing to our animation to make it a little bit more attractive. And that's something that I would want you to do as you go forward. So one thing I can do here is I'm going to go to this easing right now and just do the very, very beginning ease. And so I'm going to make it move in. So it's going to move in fast and it's going to slow down. Now what's kind of interesting about this ease, I can even do a custom ease, and I could do something kind of fun with that. If I go to like an ease in, I can actually play with it just a little bit. And there's even this like bounce and elastic, which is kind of fun, because if you use one like that, you'll see it goes boing. Let's see. That's not the one I want. Definitely don't want the elastic. Let's see the ease in. Boing. Yeah, that doesn't look that good. So I'm just going to go back to the classic easing, and I'm going to change the intensity to 100%. So it's going to ease in. Now I'm going to ease out by changing this one to negative 100. Then the next one will be positive 100 as it goes up. Then you'll go to the next one and it will be negative 100. And you'll see, if we were to test our animation now, you'll see it looks a little bit better. Now it's hovering a little bit in the air, and that's because we have to consider how close these keyframes are, and we have to adjust all the distances of those keyframes in order to get the animation to work a little bit better. And an easy way to adjust that stuff is to use the F5 and Shift F5 method to add and subtract keyframes. If you don't have anything selected, you just place your I-bar in between two frames. You can add frames with F5, and you can remove frames with Shift F5. In this way, you can control the length of the animation, and you might get a little bit better results. And we don't really need to worry about, what frame numbers we're going to, because anytime that we use code, we're going to jump to a frame label instead of a frame number. Now, I do want to point out that I have another one here. You remember I have this animation one. The reason that I made these two separate keyframes is because if I did jump to the anim, I want to make sure it doesn't have code on that one frame, because the one before has that code on it that says this stop. And if I told it to jump to a frame where it had code that said this stop, then it would jump to it, tell it to play it, and then it would run the code and it would immediately stop it. So we always have to make sure that those are two separate layers. This at least gives you an introduction to how we might set up the scene. One thing that we might want to do at this point right here is actually create a mask for this object so that it would be masked out. A simple way of doing that actually is with our graphics itself, meaning that we could have a shape which looks like the original background, with this circle, we could have that on top of it and create a layer where it goes behind it. So an example of that is I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this layer, and I'm going to break that apart real quick. I'm going to just break apart that layer. This was the duplicate one of it. And I'm going to go ahead and cut off some stuff there. Boom. Make sure that I'm lock all the layers that you don't want to delete anything of. I'm just going to get to the edge there, get to that edge, get to that edge. And now what I've just done is just create a very simple version of what that background might look like. And now if I have that in front of the ball, you'll see it appears as though the ball is actually going into that hole. I just have to be careful that the ball doesn't end up in a place where I don't have any graphics. So, of course, if you were to do this, then we would need to extend that graphic out a little bit just to make sure that is indeed hidden. And once again, all that is just a very simple way of hiding something so it appears to be going inside of it. And we've created, with just one simple tutorial, we've created a pretty interesting animation, although it's not a beautiful one. Certainly, that's something that you can improve as you continue with the animation. The last thing that we would want to do is just make our publication settings a little bit better. One of the things that I like to do is center the stage, and you can make it responsive if you want it scalable, which is nice. And then I like to include the JavaScript inside the HTML. And then when I publish this thing, let's save and publish it. All I have is one file now. It doesn't have two files, it's JavaScript and HTML. Just has the one file, and it's nice and centered on the page. And if you did rescale this thing, you'll see that it would scale down. So that's kind of nice, just makes a little bit better animation. Of course, I don't love the fact that it has a white background, but these are things that you can change as you do your own version. So let me know if you have any questions, and looking forward to seeing what you do. Thanks.